In the previous video, we created a very straightforward React app. We looked at the fact that we had index.html that basically provided a container or a space in which to actually put our JavaScript code. Our JavaScript code was written on index.js within React. And what we were doing is we were taking this JavaScript code, we were using JavaScript to render some HTML that we write within it and inserted it within the HTML, giving us something that looked like this. Now, the basic purpose of React is to convert or is to render the interface. It basically is the view portion of the MVC model. Now, what this means is that it is a way for us to break down the interface that the user sees. And the way React approaches this interface is by treating everything as a component. The idea of components is that you take your application that you want to build in React and you break it down into smaller functional units. For instance, think about a task manager. If I was thinking about building a task manager, I could decompose it into smaller components that maybe look like this. I could have a header component. Within the header component, I could have an input box or a box that takes task inputs, and then as I input things within this input box, I render them out in a form of list as various tasks. This interface can be broken down into many components. One functional unit could be the header, rendering the header and all that complexity. Another one would be to deal with the input box and the taking of the input and converting those inputs into tasks. Another component could be actually presenting the task. Another one could actually be compiling the list, compiling each task that's present into a list of tasks. And so you can have many components in this application, right? In this one, I would have 1, 2, 3, 4, but 5 JavaScript files that each handle different parts of the code. So far, if you imagine it, we've created one JavaScript file, index.js. Now, in our previous example, we created this function, this JavaScript function, that returned this H1 code, this H1 piece of HTML. As we mentioned, this H1 is actually JSX that's actually converted into React that then converts it into actual HTML. Now, this component-based architecture relies on these kinds of functional components. But in addition to functional components that can exist in React, you can also have class-based components that can exist in React. Before we actually take a look at class-based components, let's think about how we can actually have components kind of build on each other or feed information from one to another. Right? Let's think about actually building another JavaScript file. Right? So let's think about, okay, maybe I want to, in this application, want to have this input box. Okay, I already have a header, right? And so it's called the starter project, but I can kind of change that. I can modify that to say something like task manager. It presents task manager out there. Now, I can add some CSS to this to actually make it look better. And so all the CSS would need to do, we need to be part of the source. If I wanted to, I could have like an index.css. I could give this H1 maybe like an ID or a div or a class, whatever, right? But I'm not going to do that right now. Let's think about, okay, what if I want to actually add like an input text box to this application now? So that would be a separate component. Now, to have this separate component part of this, how may one actually do that? Well, a couple of different ways. Let's think about it like this. Because it's a separate component, I need to have a separate JavaScript file that actually renders that component out. And so within my source directory, I'm going to actually create a new folder I'm going to create a new folder. I'm just going to call this folder components. Okay. Within this folder called components, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file. Let's call this, for instance, searchbar.js. So this is really, the second component that I'm actually building in this application. And the purpose of this is to actually take text input if we want. So a couple of things I'm going to have. I'm going to first of all have my import statements. I'm going to import React. I'm going to import So I'm going to import those two components, and then the basic idea is that we actually want to use a JavaScript function over here to actually render the input box. And what we'll do when we render that input box is in some way then feed that input box out of this component, this JavaScript that we've written, right? And so let's say I write a function. Let's call this taskbar. Oh, actually, you know what? I don't know why I call it search bar. Let's rename that to like taskbar. Yeah. So we're going to create a function called taskbar. It's a JavaScript function. It's an arrow function, and all this function really does is it returns something. It returns a space where input is taken. Now, this backslash is very important in JSX. So whenever you have these kinds of tags, input tags, link tags, things of that nature, tags that only have an opening tag, there's no specific closing tag to that, remember you've got to close it before the closing tag mark by specifying this /, right? And so this is just a very simple input tag, and all this function does is it returns the HTML rendering of an input tag. Again, this is JSX, this is not HTML. And one of the things we've got to do is in some way we've got to include the taskbar as part of index.js, right? Because we want it to show up below right here. And so we've got to export the HTML that comes out from this function. And the way we do that in React is by specifying export and the name of the function. And the name of the function is taskbar. So I'm going to export this taskbar function out to index.js. Okay, but while I've exported this function, I haven't actually included it in index.js. Just like we are importing React DOM from React DOM and React from React, we need to import this taskbar component into index.js, and the way we do that is by specifying import taskbar from, we need to find the component now, right? And the component is in the components directory, and the function, and it is taskbar, right? And so this function, we are importing the taskbar component as taskbar into index.js, right? Now, to use the taskbar component right under this header of task manager, all we would need to do is specify taskbar. So the error message we get over here when we try to include taskbar is that it says adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. And so what we're going to do is we're going to enclose the H1 task manager header and the taskbar in a div tag. And when we do that, we get our task manager with an input that allows us with an input box, a task box that allows us to type things inside there, right? And so now we have a very simple two-component interface system, one that displays a header, one that displays like an input box that allows us to take input in some way. We're going to add more detail to this, but very simply, these are two functional components. The reason they call it functional components is because we're using functions to create these components that are related to each other.